Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to Cheesemans Ecology Safari's live webinar, Photographing the Unseen, Borneo's Biodiversity with Charlie Ryan. I'm Adam Walter, the Marketing Director here at Cheesemans, and we're so glad you've joined us for this special journey into one of the most ecologically rich regions on Earth. Whether you're a dedicated wildlife photographer, conservation enthusiast, or simply curious about what it's like to explore deep tropical rainforests, you're in for a treat tonight. Borneo is home to some of the most rare and captivating wildlife, from ancient rainforests to endemic mammals to vibrant bird life and breathtaking macro subjects. Our May 2026 expedition offers a unique opportunity to travel with our expert leader, photographing the region's elusive species and learning how to tell powerful stories through your lens. Now, tonight, you're going to get a firsthand look at the photographic opportunities, the challenges, and unforgettable moments that define this trip. And you'll learn why it's so popular with wildlife photographers and enthusiasts alike. Now, I'm honored to introduce our presenter this evening, Charlie Ryan. Charlie is a wildlife biologist, he's a conservationist, and he's the trip leader for our Borneo expeditions. He's spent years exploring the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, and his work as a scientist and a photographer, it gives him a kind of a unique perspective on capturing wildlife in some of the most challenging and rewarding environments on the planet. He's going to take us through the biodiversity, the landscapes, and the photographic potential at what makes Borneo such a special place. In addition to Charlie, we also have our co-CEO and co-owner. She's also the wildlife safari coordinator for this trip. Her name's Krista Haney. She's on the call. She's going to field questions at the end about details. Now, after we talk, that brings up my next question. So if you do have anything you want to ask in the middle of the presentation, please drop it in the chat at the bottom of your window. We're going to answer all those questions at the end. I'm going to be fielding them so that I can get them to Charlie as soon as he's done his presentation. And with that, let's begin. Charlie, thank you for being here. Please take us into the heart of Borneo.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's having a good Friday evening. Just real quick, Adam, do you want me just to go ahead and start screen sharing now?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, perfect. Oh, sorry, just give me 1 second here. All right, and just to confirm, Adam, everyone can see full screen?
Good to go.
Okay, perfect. Well, yes, everyone, thanks for taking time out of your Friday evening to listen. It's nice to see some familiar faces. I saw Lori in there, and I can see Jean there. And then I saw Steve's name, which is nice because I haven't seen Steve's name in forever. But yeah, so today I'm just going to be talking about Borneo, talking about what it's like to be doing photography here. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, my name is Charlie Ryan, for those who I have not had the chance to meet yet, and I truly hope that I meet all of you someday on a Cheeseman trip. So my name is Charlie Ryan. I'm originally from the US, and I've been living out in Borneo for about 20 years now. I studied environmental sciences and then moved out to Borneo to just do an internship because I wanted some field experience. And so I was supposed to be out here for 6 months, and 20 years later, I'm still here. I just absolutely fell in love with Borneo, the wildlife, the environment, the people, and then just in general, all of Southeast Asia is just there's so many fascinating kind of wildlife destinations that it's really like the only place I want to live now. So when I first moved out to Borneo, I was working in community development projects, and so I was running forest restoration projects, and then we were looking at how to incorporate ecotourism into communities that as a channel for alternative livelihood. I think before, a lot of communities here were always kind of hunting communities, or there's a lot of people that were kind of extracting valuable resources out of forests. And so one of the things we were looking at was trying to create alternative livelihoods that would be a more sustainable way for people to make money. The pictures on the screen here, this is an ethnic group called the Penan people, which were traditionally hunter-gatherers living in the interior of Borneo. And so one of the pilot projects I was working on was um, helping these small semi-nomadic communities set up kind of cultural stays, hiking trips, and all that in a hope that they could protect their ancestral homeland, which was at risk of logging. And it was quite an amazing place because um, it would take about 2 to 4 days to get out to these villages. And when you would get out to these villages, it was amazing because it was like stepping back in time 100 years where no cars, no cell phone, no electricity. And it was a really amazing experience for getting to experience and, becoming friends with these people that were just these absolute experts when it came to the rainforest. It's these communities that are so in touch with their surroundings because they rely on being able to, find food in the forest as they were traveling nomadically. I just found it so amazing how they had such a deep connection with the environment here, where they would know every single plant that's a food source, that's medicinal value, and then like a strong like animist belief system that is all surrounding the forest. So I'm gonna just start talking about Borneo, and we're gonna start moving into what it's like, what the wildlife is like, and how photography is here. Now I can not only see Gene, I can see John Richardson there. Hi, John. He's been out here twice now, so he will definitely know what I'm talking about. So Borneo is the third largest island in the world, and it is largely lowland tropical rainforest and then hill and montane forest. For the Cheeseman trip, these are some of the environments we are in. So this is Downham Valley, which to me is one of my favorite places on the planet. Forest that, it's class one primary forest, rolling hills, very large canopy where, the average canopy height is uh, anywhere from 100 to 150 feet, with, the emergent species getting up to almost 320 feet now. And so it's the largest tropical trees in the world are in Borneo. And on the Cheeseman trip in Downham Valley, the trip spends 4 days here. Um, while I'm talking about the environments and stuff, I'm also just going to be mentioning about, these are kind of places that are on the Cheeseman Borneo trip. When you're in Downham, it's all about walking to look for wildlife. This is the Kinabatangan River, and so the entire northeastern seaboard of Borneo is all very flat floodplains, lowland forest, and the Kinabatangan River is the largest river in northern Borneo, and it's an amazing place to see an array of wildlife. And for the Kinabatangan, when you're here and you're looking for wildlife, it's primarily by boat. And so it's, kind of similar to African safaris where early morning river cruise, afternoon river cruise, and the stuff you see on the river is really, really amazing. This is another area. This is Mailao Basin, which this is just another good example of what the environment is looking for. Borneo, when it comes to species, it's hard to find somewhere in the world that is as biodiverse as the forests are here. And this is some more from the Kinabatangan. All right, so now I want to start talking about photography. There are so many amazing species to see in Borneo. I mean, there's incredible endemic bird species, orangutan, on an average Cheeseman trip. Most people see 9 to 10 species of primates, and then, cats, diversity of deer species, civets, all this kind of stuff. And so when you read about Borneo, there's all these incredible species that you want to see. But then when it comes to photography in Borneo is fantastic, but it's not always easy doing photography in tropical rainforests. You're dealing with a lot of different elements. You're dealing with kind of wet tropical rainforest. You're dealing with a very large, tall canopy that can make light conditions very hard. Um, I always people, sometimes I'll get people that'll be like, sending me a picture of a leopard in Africa at sunset, or, like this kind of stuff where, in Africa, where, you have these open plains, dry environment, and they'll ask me, oh, so, can we get like, all these kind of shots at sunset and all this kind of stuff. And I think it's very different here where the main thing is just getting nice, clean images, which can be a challenge in itself, but that's what makes it so fun. So, moving to orangutans. Orangutans in Borneo, obviously they're incredible, great ape species. And where all of the like for where the Cheeseman trip is in northern Borneo, it is, in my opinion, it is the best place in the entire region to see orangutans in the wild. Orangutans are only found in Borneo and Sumatra, and this northern part of Borneo is the only place that has a population that's increasing, where everywhere else they're decreasing. And so this northern area where the Cheeseman trip explores, you get a fantastic population, and essentially everywhere on the trip goes, you have very good opportunities to see orangutans and a big other array of wildlife. So this image, this is from the Sepalak Orangutan Sanctuary. Um, it's a place it's quite nice to start here on like the first day of the trip, because it's, I see it as being a very nice warm up with, refamiliarizing yourself with your camera. Um, it's a space where there's no fences, and so the orangutans can move freely. Um, but it also makes it, where they have feeding stations, and so you can go and watch the feeding times. But it's a really nice way to kind of get into the groove when you're starting a trip, to, familiarize yourself with the camera, start getting some practice shots in. And so the Sepalak Sanctuary makes really good photography for that. And it's really fun just as a way to kind of ease into a different environment. So I'm just going to be going through a few images, and I think, and I'll talk about photography a bit, but I think a lot of people are always thinking about, like what makes an image good, what are the parameters, you don't want, light sources to be blowing out and all this kind of stuff. But, as I was mentioning before, photography can be so challenging here that honestly, a lot of times if I'm, on like a sighting, and this doesn't matter what species it is, whether it's interesting pheasant on the ground, or Bornean ground kook, or all this kind of stuff. It's, for me, getting like a clean in focus image, that I already consider a win. This is a young male orangutan that is about 2.5 years old. And so actually the mother is just sitting up on a branch on the left. But I really like photograph. Like when it comes to orangutans, my favorite to photograph would be mother and young, and then like the big dominant flanged males. For those that aren't familiar with orangutans are very different than other great ape species, because with great apes, bonobos, chimps, gorillas, they're all living in these very tightly bonded family groups, and so when you go, there's, many individuals around, there's a whole lot of subjects, where when it comes to orangutans, they are fairly solitary, and so the only time that they're semi-social is when you have a mother and a baby together, because the mom will raise the young up until about an average of 7 years. But then other than that, you're always just finding individuals that are moving, on their own. And probably the reason for that is that, even though Borneo is, one of the most diverse places in the world for, species, food competition is very, very challenging here, where even though you look at the Bornean rainforest, and there's, thousands of, species and all that, the actual, kind of fruiting capacity of the forest is quite low. And so that is probably a very good reason of why orangutans have developed to be more solitary than the other great apes. And then if anyone does not know this, so all the great apes, so gorillas, chimps, bonobos, orangutan, they all descended from gibbons, and so they split off from gibbons, which are considered lesser apes, and that split happened about 40 million years ago. So this image, this is a big male from Taban Wildlife Reserve, and this is also another area that gets visited on the Cheeseman Borneo trip. This individual, so females are very, they're very sedentary in the fact that they have a very small home range, so they have a home range of 800 square meters, and so that's less than 1 square kilometer, and so you're talking about a half mile that is their, half mile squared, which would be their home territory. The females do travel outside of it a bit, but then they always return home. Where then with the bigger males, they're much more nomadic, because what the males are doing is that they are traveling between many different female ranges, just because their main job is they're just looking to breed with females and create more orangutans. Then this individual lives, in the vicinity of the lodge that we stay at. And a lot of times when there's fruiting trees around the lodge, he shows up. And it's always quite nice when you have like a fruiting fig on trip, because it becomes a wildlife magnet. All the birds, all the mammals, they're all capitalizing on that, because there's no defined fruiting season in Borneo. Where in a lot of other places, okay, you say, okay, this is the fruiting season, this is what it comes. In Borneo, the fruiting cycle is on what we call a super annual cycle, where, so the majority of trees, for tree volume, so 80% of the tree volume in Borneo is in the dipterocarp family, which is these very large trees where dipterocarps originally originated from Africa, and then they had spread to the east, and then you find dipterocarps all the way to Papua New Guinea. These trees are very large, very tall, slow hardwood growing trees. And because they're on a superannual cycle called massed fruiting, they only fruit every 2 to 11 years. And so that means when they do fruit, there's an abundance of food for about 6 weeks. But then outside of, these trees, which make up the majority of large trees in the Borneo rainforest, all of the wildlife, orangutan, birds, hornbills, all of that, they're relying on fruiting figs, macaranga, all these smaller trees that are, fruiting very consistently, where we're in the ficus genus. Some figs will fruit once a year, some fig species will fruit twice a year, 3 times a year, up until about, like the most prolific fruiting figs, they fruit about every 8 weeks. So here are just a few images of a few different individuals. So on the right side, this is an orangutan in a fruiting fig tree. This is a kind of mid-aged male on the far right. In the center, we have a young male. And then on the far left, we have a very young individual that is probably 2.5 years old. With what I was talking about, where like how in Africa or, more open places, it's very easy to set up these kind of like beautifully crafted images, at sunset with dust and all that kind of stuff, where it's quite challenging to do that. And so a lot of times what I'm looking at is how to incorporate the environment and the background into an image to tell a story, where I really like the image on the left that has the young pink leaves around the orangutan, because that is one thing that they really like to eat. Like orangutans, they're not just eating fruit, like they probably have recorded a couple thousand different things that orangutans have eating, like when it comes to a range of fruit species, young leaves, termites, birds' eggs, and so they're not, kind of opportunity eaters. They have a very diverse diet that they eat, but now what scientists are thinking is that they're actually planning a very balanced meal plan for themselves. And so, if they've been in a big canopy fig feeding on figs for 5 or 6 days, then they say, okay, enough fruit. the stomach is too acidic. Now I need to go find some young leaves and eat that. And so they're actually keeping a mental map of the trees that are in their home range they generally remember, okay, these trees generally fruit at this time of year. This tree is growing new leaves at this time of year. And they're actually planning their movements through their home range based on when these trees are generally fruiting and producing food for them. So these guys are my favorite. And it's always an interesting thing because actually 90% of people that are coming to do photography in Borneo and want to see orangutans, they always want to see the big males that have the big flanged faces, and it's um not all males develop to be, big alpha dominant male orangutans. It's actually about 50-50 in the male population will actually develop these big flanges, these big flanges on the face. It's not just something that, grows as they age. It's all hormonal. And so the more dominant they are and the more they're breeding, the bigger the flanges get, And so if you go to a zoo and anywhere in the US or anywhere in the world that has orangutan, you see these males with these just, huge pancake faces. And you almost never see that in the wild because, if you have a single male orangutan in a zoo, there's no other competition from other males. And so the face just continues to grow and grow and grow where, the image of this orangutan on the screen right now, if another male, kind of moves into his area and, is more dominant than him, then his flanges will actually start to shrink and shrivel down again, and he'll start to lose body mass. And so it's a very interesting thing. So there's a thing called bimaturism, and it's quite rare in species. The only one, like off the top of my head, that I know is like the black-maned lions in Africa. But with bimaturism, what happens is as a male orangutan ages, um, if there are already many dominant males in the area, that male will stay small so he is not competing with the other large dominant males. And then, because there's a lot of fighting between the big dominant males because they're all competing for the females in the region. So it benefits these males, as part of the bimaturism, it benefits the males to not grow large because then the dominant male orangutans don't see them as being a threat. And so they get left alone by the other big orangutans in the area. And they actually just finished a study that is now showing that for all orangutan births, that about 50% of them come from dominant males, and the other 50% come from these smaller old males that didn't get big, that didn't get the big flanged faces. And now they think it's just completely on the female preference that whether they like, the bigger dominant males or the smaller males. But one of the most interesting things about it is, so say you have a 30-year-old male orangutan that has never grown flanges, never that, because there were so many other dominant males in the area. Say a couple of the dominant males in his area die or move somewhere else, and then all of a sudden there is a space for him to become a dominant male. In 6 to 9 months, he can double or triple in size and grow these flanges and develop into being a large male orangutan where they max out at about 220 pounds. And so the thing I was saying about like black maned lions, so it's the exact same thing. If there's too many black maned lions in an area, say you're in Okavango or anywhere, if there's too many black maned lions, the other male lions will not develop and become these bigger dominant lions. They'll stay small so they're not competing, and it's safer for them to stay small. All right, so I'm going to continue on, but yeah, so this big male, we found him. There's an image from the Cheeseman trip in this last May, and he's sitting on a limestone cliff just above Gomantong Caves, which is one of my favorite areas in Borneo. This is another guy. You'll notice, and for me with photography, I'm going to go through like a couple different images. But so these would be kind of, I would say that these are like my wildlife images as my photography has improved over the years. I'll show some photos, where it's, kind of close up images and all this kind of stuff. And I remember years ago, I'd met a photographer that I had a lot of respect for, and I'd always followed his work. And I'd asked him if I could show him like five of my favorite images. And so I chose five of my favorite pictures and showed it to him, and they're all these really kind of close-up shots of, faces and like this kind of stuff. And the guy came back to me and he was like, "Congratulations, you got really close to five different animals." But he was like, "But the image isn't necessarily telling the story." And so I really like in images, like this, where it actually tells the story of the environment they're in, where this big male orangutan, this is in Downham Valley, about 1 kilometer from the lodge. But I love him being on this, huge dipterocarp tree with like the mist in the background and showing the tropical rainforest, because then it starts telling the story of where the orangutans live, what are the conditions like. And I think that brings like a lot more meaning into photography and imagery. The babies, I love to photograph. Pretty much the first minimum 18 months in an orangutan's life, the baby is always hanging on to the mom. And I mean, and they're so strong that it's so incredible to watch, a mother orangutan with this little tiny baby. And, as she's swinging and kind of crashing around, the baby's always just sitting there. And when you're watching her doing photography, so much of the time, the mother has not a care in the world that you exist, and she doesn't really look at you and all that. But then the babies are so curious, and so if mom's sleeping or just, kind of gazing off into the distance, the babies generally are always watching us because honestly, from my opinion, I think it's just curiosity. This is an image from the Kinabatangan River, which on the Cheeseman trip, you spend 4 days out in this area, which is it's fantastic. This is the place I was talking about where it's all river cruises. And so early morning, late afternoon, there can be really nice light on the river. Um, and then I like this story or this image because it shows the story of how important figs are to not only orangutan but all other wildlife. And so all of the figs that are around this orangutan is called Ficus racemosa, which is a riverine fig that is a very important food source for most wildlife in all river areas in Southeast Asia. Um, there's a very high yielding fruiting species. It fruits every 8 weeks. And so it's a very important food source for, orangutans, macaques, langurs, bearded pigs, deer, all that, because there's so many of these figs along the river. And so there's almost always one that is fruiting. All right. And I'm putting here because this is always things I'm trying to think about. When it comes to doing things differently, and you can kind of go out and you can take a picture of an orangutan over and over again, but then I'm trying to figure out how to change things up. And so one of the things I love doing is doing these kind of like tighter shots on, like the top left of like an orangutan that has like a fruit in its hand, or the bottom left, which is a huge male hand. I love looking at how human-like the hand is, and I think that is such a good representation of the very close DNA that they have to humans. Where I mean, scientists are always arguing about it, but currently they think orangutans are the closest genetically to humans, and then they also think that they're the best critical thinkers. Um, I love the top right just because it was a really nice background, and so it looks like it's this kind of even, very even background, but that's actually the head was the only thing really showing through a bunch of leaves around it. And so like that smooth green is coming from leaves that were kind of blocking around, but then shooting it on like a tight aperture, then you start to get that more even background. And then with the bottom right, I love the big male faces. And so, I love habitat shots and showing the story, but then I also love the big males when you get up close to them, just because the detail in their faces are just incredible. And then also their eyes, it's like when an orangutan is watching you, I mean, like making eye contact to me with an orangutan is just amazing because it seems like it's really thinking deeply about you, which I think is an amazing thing for a species. Um, and then this goes back to what I'm saying is, always trying to change it up where, it's nice to have some really up close detailed shots, but then images like this, which this is from Tabon Wildlife Reserve, where it's a really nice place. We're in Tabon. We're mostly doing game drives, looking for wildlife, that kind of stuff. But it's really nice because the side of the road, a lot of times it's a hill that's going down. And so you're just looking into the canopy of the trees, which I find it really beautiful when you get this habitat of showing because for orangutans, they're the most arboreal of all the great apes. They're spending the majority of their lives, high in the canopy, anywhere from, sometimes they do come to the ground for short amounts of time, but for the most part, they're living their life, minimum 30, 50, 100 feet off the ground because that is where they're searching for food. This is also another big male, and I love this image just because it was just really good conditions, and so you had nice, really bright sun on the orangutan that really made the details of like the really beautiful coat and the face details pop. This was from also Tabon Wildlife Reserve, so a few months a year, there's a species of tree called Endosperm that fruits. And so when you're in Tabon, there's an abundance of these species. The orangutan sightings are just amazing, where you can see 5, 6, 7 orangutan every day when you get the fruiting rate. The one challenge with that is, as I was talking about, where there's no defined fruiting season, that fruiting season can be, April, May, June. The next year it can be August, September, October. And so it's really hard to judge when the trees are going to be fruiting. And then this is another thing that I'm always thinking about, because the orangutan have, so when you look at an orangutan, you think it has this really, long, thick coat. They have very long hair, but their coats are very, very thin. And so one of the things that I love with these thin coats is to try to find backlighting on them and then start getting the rim lighting around the fur on their bodies to light up. This is from Donham Valley, and then this is from inside the lodge area. In Donham Valley, there's about 30 orangutans that live in the vicinity of the lodge. And they're all very habituated to people because they're like third generation of young that are, being raised with the lodge there with, people just going to look at them without, hunting or any of this kind of stuff. Just some more images of the big males, and these are all from Donham Valley. The far right, when it does happen, it's amazing when you get some. So the big males spend the most time on the ground out, compared to the smaller males or females. They don't spend the majority of time on the ground. They come down to feed on certain things, and so a lot of times when they're coming down to the ground, it means that they've been feeding on a lot of fruits, and so then they come down to eat ginger stalks. And so the nice thing about in Donham is that there's all these gingers along the road that go into the lodge. And so sometimes you find these big males just hanging out in the ginger groves feeding, which make for some really excellent photography. So the first two images, or the two images to the right, is the same individual at different time periods, and you can see that what I was talking about with these flanges on his face, they look different. And that's because depending on how much he's breeding or if he's winning fights with other male orangutans, these flanges will change in size and shape. All right. So just to touch base on challenges of photography in tropical rainforest. I put tropical rainforest photography is some of the most difficult in the world. I can't think of an environment that you're dealing with challenges. Lighting conditions, always number one. I've been doing tropical rainforest photography for so long that if I'm doing a personal travel and I'm going to Africa or somewhere else, it takes me like a while to adjust into the fact that there is so much light and you're not having to use crazy high ISO and slow shutter speed. But that's definitely something that comes into play, when you're doing a trip in Borneo. Lighting conditions is a big one, shooting really slow shutter speeds, especially in places like Dunham Valley or if you're in birding heights, that kind of stuff. Very, very challenging. Heat and humidity. Yeah, I mean, Borneo, it's an amazing place. It's also very hot and very humid. You know, Before this meeting started, Krista was talking about how it was 88 degrees in California today, and it's like what I told her was it's like it's 7 a.m. here, it's already 88, and it's just going to get warmer. Um, I think the other challenge, and this is more from you know camera ability, is the autofocus, and definitely with mirrorless and all that, it's improved a lot. But one of the things is, it's if you're, this image on the right, if you're photographing this, you're dealing with, tons of leaves and branches around it. And so a lot of times your autofocus it isn't necessarily picking up the subject or the animal, it's trying to pick up that. And so the best way of dealing with that is always shooting center pointed as the priority, and then you have a lot better chance of getting through leaves and stuff that are around the subject. And then also moving subjects. There are times where you find something where it's just sitting and resting, but a lot of times the animals in the tropical rainforest, they're moving because they're going somewhere, right? They're looking for food, or they're following the calls of barbets, because when a lot of animals are listening to when there's a lot of barbets calling in the same area, they know there's a fruiting tree, and so then they're moving towards that. And now I just want to go through some of the other species. Sorry, Adam, I'm talking to 8:45, is that right?
You can keep going, Charlie. You're making good
Okay,
progress. You're good.
perfect. So yeah, I'm just going to go through some other species here. I think everyone who's ever come to Borneo usually come because, the iconic orangutan species. But the amazing thing about Borneo is there's so much else to see here. I put it, if, we're talking tropical rainforest mammals, I think it's like one of the best places in the world for it. I put it as like in top 10 for like great mammal photography. Bird photography, amazing, very challenging. Birds here are shy, pittas, like all this kind of stuff. And it's only in like the last few years that now, feeding stations, that kind of stuff are starting to open up, which is amazing because now it's taken all of these kind of unknown, cryptic, very difficult species, and now it's very, very accessible to go out and shoot these in heights. So the species that we're looking at from left to right, so we have Western tarsier, which is my personal favorite animal and spirit animal. In the center, I consider one of the most beautiful hornbills in the world. The only other one that I could think that would be more beautiful than the Rhinoceros hornbill would be the red-knobbed hornbill. And then on the far right, we have southern pig-tailed macaques, which are extremely common in lowland montane forests here. But just because they're common doesn't mean that they aren't excellent photography subjects. They have beautiful faces. There's a lot of personality. The groups go, 50 to 100 individuals in a group, and it makes for some really wonderful images. This is another big one, very iconic species, and it's actually just been upgraded to its own species. So now this is the Bornean elephant. They always used to call it pygmy elephants, which was a subspecies to the Asian elephant. But then about 6 months ago, now they've established it as its own species of Bornean elephant. They are they are the smallest elephant species in the world. They are not small. They're, if you compare it, African elephants max out at like 8 tons. The Bornean elephant maxes out at about 2 to 2.5 tons. And so they only get to about 7 feet tall. They're only in this very northeast corner of Borneo, and there's only 1,500 in the wild, and that population is very stable. It's not growing dramatically, but it's also not decreasing, and you also don't have ivory poaching in this part of the world, which is very good for the elephants. Um, just these images, I chose these just because I like all of the different things. Like the two bottom images, I love where you have some habitat. The bottom right, this is on the Kinabatangan River, and so it's really fun to do photography on elephants from a boat. The top left is also from the Kinabatangan River. That was from we'd seen a herd of about 100, and then so they were all kind of playing in this small river ecosystem. Really, really incredible. Western tarsier, again, I like this where, earlier I had one that was a lot tighter on it, but I love this where I love showing a bit more habitat in this. And then proboscis monkeys. This is also like a very iconic Bornean species. Proboscis monkeys are endemic to the island of Borneo. They're very abundant in any sort of coastal river ecosystem. They're not hunted or anything like that. And so there's over 70,000 on the island. Wonderful photography subjects. First, evolution did them dirty, like they have some ridiculous noses, pretty strange looking species, but really fun to photograph, beautiful colors, big groups. But then one of my favorite things is like the top right is they're constantly doing these big crashing, powerful jumps. And so shooting while they're making these jumps is really, really fun. And pretty much anytime I'm in an area with them, I'll always spend a lot of time kind of sitting and waiting for them to start moving so you can try to get these jumping images. Now, pangolins. And this is just kind of showing just how diverse Borneo is. You have orangutans and all the primates, but then you start getting into the smaller mammals, and it's just an endless list of what exists. And Sunda pangolins, unfortunately, they are very rare to see here now. Best chance is like night walks or night drives. I maybe see one once every few years now. When I first moved here, like many years ago, I would probably see him a few times a year, but due to the incredible poaching for Eastern medicine, it's just decimated the population. All right, so this is so in Borneo we have 5 species of cats. This was taken on a Cheeseman trip a few months ago, and this is the Sunda leopard cat, which is small house cat size, and they thrive on forest edges where you have forest going into palm oil plantation. And so if you go and walk along a border, like I think there was a Cheesemans trip, I think it was last year, we saw 20 leopard cats in one night drive, which is like, it was like a personal record for me where like they were just everywhere. But so the point is that like, these are very abundant, easy to photograph, and I find them just to be beautiful. This is Buffy fish owl. These are beautiful fishing owls that you find throughout the lowland forests, and we always find one that's good for photography along these trips. And there's actually at the lodge that we stay at in the Kinabatangan, this is where it's from. There's a couple that are now kind of hanging around and roosting during the day. And so usually you can find them during the day, which you can make some really, really wonderful photography in the daytime with them. And then this, another one, I love this image. It's one of my favorite Rhinoceros Hornbill images I have. But I love it how it tells the story of how important hornbills are to figs. Hornbills are some of the best fruit dispersers of kind of any animal or bird in Asia because they're big birds. So they eat everything from like the really small figs to, bigger figs to bigger fruits. And so they are excellent seed dispersers because, if an orangutan eats, figs, it's only going to make it so far before he disperses the seeds. With hornbills, they're flying great distance. And so they do a really important role of spreading that fruit and actually helping the species grow in different areas. I think for Borneo, and it's kind of up to people that are into photography on whether they mostly do daytime or nighttime. But I love nighttime macro photography, and especially with using off-camera flash, light boxes, this kind of stuff, you can produce some really beautiful imagery. And so this is Bornean horn frog, which is an amazing frog. Found throughout kind of montane and lowland forests, and we can usually find it. And because they think they're camouflaged, they make really great photography subjects because they just sit there. So this North Borneo gibbons, so Taban Wildlife Reserve, I was talking about that area. This place is wonderful for them. It's the only place in Borneo that has habituated groups, and so what I was saying earlier is, so all of the great apes in the world descended from these guys. And so that split happened about 40 million years ago. And then, for people that are cat lovers, this is a lot of times why people come and, they're searching for this, because the Bornean clouded leopard is the most difficult to see, which is still considered a large cat by Panthera. Very difficult to see, but I'd say that I've spent so much time in the forest that I've been lucky enough to have some really incredible encounters with these guys. And then back to macaques. A lot of people, like on trips here, usually by like day 3, people start getting tired of seeing macaques because they are everywhere, like outside my window from where I'm sitting, they hang out at the dumpster next to my house. When you go on a safari, they are everywhere. That doesn't change the fact that they make wonderful photography subjects as well, where, to be honest, this is like one of my favorite images I've ever taken. All right, so now we're moving on to the bay owl. These are very small owls, so, they're less than a foot tall, probably around 8 inches, something like that. Really cool owls. And they're, hunting rodents and frogs and lizards, all this kind of stuff. But they really, they thrive in the lower understory of the canopy. And so like this image, this owl was probably 6 or 7 feet off the ground. I shot this image with a 100mm macro because sometimes when you find these guys, they just don't have a care in the world that you are there. And so they'll sit continuing to hunt just right next to you for, 10, 20 minutes, which is pretty amazing. Just to go through just to familiarize people with kind of like the most important things. I'm not going to do a giant list, but to me, the most important stuff when considering coming here is great lenses. So for me, I'm always carrying a super telephoto, either a 600 or a 400. And then my other lenses that I carry is usually 100 to 500, 70 to 200, and then a wide angle. If you're more into bird photography, a 600 is a great choice. If you're more into all-around birds and mammals, then usually I recommend like the 400 2.8 just because it does such a great job with low light conditions. And then obviously with camera bodies, mirrorless has gone a long way with improving ISO, less noise, and now with post-processing with DxO, Topaz, all this kind of stuff, you can do so much more with imaging. But definitely having a camera body, whether it's, Canon, Nikon, Sony, having something that can handle high ISOs, where it's not uncommon for me to be shooting at, 6400, 10,000 ISO, especially if you're finding something that's great, right at sunrise or, after sunset when things are getting dark, that definitely plays into it. For me, I always carry tripod with a gimbal on it because I think that's very important for low light conditions. And then, for people that, are into macro, external flash, some sort of light box or diffuser, very, very important. But then the other thing is waterproofing your gear is so important here. I have a great camera bag that I always carry with me that, is like f-stop, has all this stuff. Great When I'm out trekking in the forest here, I never carry that with me because all I carry is just a big rubber waterproof backpack that when it starts raining, I can put all of my camera gear, my phone, everything stuffed in there, and then I'm not going to worry about it again. All right. Adam, do you want me to hand it back to you?
No, we'll stay full screen with this, folks. It's the time for the Q&A. If you have some questions you'd like to ask, drop them in the chat. Krista, I think you have one you wanted to start off with.
Well, I think that was a really great way to end, Charlie, and because people probably do have a lot of questions about the gear, they often do prior to trips. But like, what would be one essential piece if people have to have something that you'd recommend, or even a little trick or tip about a piece to bring
I,
with
I
you?
mean, I mean, for me, having a big waterproof backpack to me
Yeah.
is the most important thing, because the amount of times that, people are bringing a camera bag that advertises as being, this is waterproof and you have your rain cover or your poncho to go over it. After it rains hard here for about 30
Mhm.
minutes, all of those things are pointless.
I completely agree.
Like no matter what, your stuff is going to get wet, and I think that's the biggest risk of being on a photography trip and having your camera break due to moisture is just awful.
I have one. Charlie, with Borneo being so biodiverse, what's like a lesser known species that people tend to miss when they're coming out
I
to?
mean, I I don't think it's I couldn't say it's one. I think just the thing that people get surprised about, and it's like anywhere where, a lot of times you're going, if you're going to India, you're going to see tigers. If you're going to Rwanda, you're going to see mountain gorillas. But it's just all of the small animals here in the diversity, where it's like whether you're talking about, mouse deer, barking deer, Sunda badger, moon rat. I mean, moon rat is a pure white rat where the body is about this big that runs around the forest floor. And so I think it's just the number of small animals, or colugo, which most people, I'm like, oh look, it's a colugo, and they say, what word was that? Where it's like, these are gliding mammals that that live here, but so I think it's everything that is here that I think would like impress people with just the diversity.
Lori would like to ask, is the Bornean leopard as far away as the snow leopard in India, or can you get much closer?
So the Bornean clouded leopard, if you find it, they don't care at all. Like you can see it within 15, 20 feet. The challenge is finding it. It's like now you can go to snow leopard, it's like pretty much 100% chance you're going to see it. It's not necessarily going to be really close, but you're going to see it. And like that was considered like before, like the most difficult to see. I mean, with the Bornean clouded leopard, I can walk every day for 365 days a year, and I might see one and I might not. And so it's a very, very challenging to see. But if you do see them, they're not afraid of people because they're an apex predator here.
This is more general. So if somebody's not a photographer, what is one thing that everyone needs to experience when coming to Borneo, whether you be a photographer or just wildlife?
Um, I mean, honestly, like whether you're a photographer or not, it's such an incredible place for me. Like there's like these little experiences that I just love. Like if you're out on like a night walk, turning off your lights and just sitting quietly for like 30 seconds to a minute and like listen, because as soon as you turn off the light, all of a sudden, it's like your auditory increases because you're not relying on sight. And it's just listening to like the thousands of sound that make this like jungle melody. So it's little things like that, but it's just the diversity of Borneo, and it's like the way the forest looks and how wild it feels. It truly is incredible.
Awesome. If anybody else has any further questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll give you a couple of seconds. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. All right. Well, folks, unless you have any more questions that we can answer, that's all the time we have for this webinar tonight. We want to thank Charlie again for his wonderful presentation. It was fantastic. So when I think, wait, hold on, we had a question come in. How would you compare Borneo? Daniel Sands wants to know how you would compare Borneo, Indonesia to this trip.
Oh, to where Cheeseman goes to Malaysian Borneo, and so that in comparison to Indonesian Borneo, so it's like night and day. So Gunung Palung is the probably best national park in Indonesian Borneo. This is where Tim Lehman and Cheryl Knott have their orangutan conservation project, where that's like the big Nat Geo funded one. You could spend 6 months in Gunung Palung, and then you could spend 6 days in Danam Valley, and you would see probably more in the 6 days in Danam Valley than you would in Gunung Palung. It's just what wildlife concentration is much less, and there's a lot more. Sabah doesn't have any more commercial logging. There's no more commercial land that's allowed for palm oil. Where Indonesian Borneo, they're destroying it pretty quick, and so wildlife populations are crashing at a rapid rate on the southern part of the island. Adam, you're muted again.
Sorry about that. Do orangutans descend the trees to poop like sloths do?
No, no, they'll poop anywhere.
We also have
Anybody else?
one question. How much time is spent in vehicles versus hiking or walking?
So the nice thing about like the Borneo trip is that the furthest you kind of have to travel is about 4 hours, but most, travel time between lodges is, about 2 hours. But so each place, it depends, and so the first stop in Sepilok, you're mostly doing kind of short walks around Sepilok and in like the forest reserve. But then you get to the Kinabatangan for 4 days where it's primarily just river cruises and you're not doing much for walking. You get to Tabin, it's all about game drives, night drive, early morning drive with very little walking. When you get into Danam Valley, then it's all about walking. But for me, I think it's really nice actually to switch up the style of how you're looking for wildlife because each experience is different. When you're on a boat, it's great. It's easy, but then you're limited by the position of the boat, and so then when you get to Danam and then you're walking, whether it's a bird or a mammal, you have the freedom of moving around it, finding good windows in the canopy, finding where the light is best. And so it's a very big mix of what it is. But then I'd also say that ability wise, whether you want to walk 5 kilometers a day, a couple miles or, more than that, all of that category, you would still see amazing stuff because you don't have to walk very far from lodges to see amazing wildlife. It's in general, and I think this is everywhere in the world, the animals and the birds that live around human habitation, in eco-lodge settings, they're comfortable with people, so they're not afraid, and so they're providing better, they're providing easier photo subjects. And yes, 12 hours of daylight.
Yep.
Nice. Anyone else? All right, Charlie. Fantastic, man. I appreciate it. Folks, if you're feeling inspired to join us in Borneo, we encourage you to visit the trip page. I'm going to post that as well as our YouTube channel in the chat, and as well as ways to get a hold of us directly. The departure is scheduled for May 2026, the peak condition for wildlife and photography, obviously, and it does tend to fill up. I'm also going to send out a follow-up email after this to everyone in the next few days, so that the webinar is going to be on replay on our YouTube channel. If you know someone that wasn't here tonight, they could benefit from viewing it, please share it by all means. Again, you'll get the email. And then if you have any additional questions, Krista is available. You can email her directly or give her a call. That's in the chat. So on behalf of all of us at Cheesemans Ecology Safaris, I want to thank you again. We hope to see you guys in the rainforest soon. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you, Charlie. Wonderful
Thanks, Charlie.
presentation.
Bye.
Bye. Great to see everybody.